Going to review some of the Python concepts that we've been learning in class, and it's using the Codesters environment. You may want to go into Codesters if you have that available and try this. I have made this a shared project, and I'll put a link to it in the description. And feel free to go ahead and copy the code into your own project and play around with it to make sure you are familiar with the different things in here. If you're watching this video and you're not a member of my class, feel free to just bring up any Python environment and copy the code in. For the most part, I think it should work. I've tried this on idle. It seems to work. Or just kind of follow along here. The first thing I talk about are comments. And I think comments are really important things to put in your code, not only because it increases the readability of your code, but it also can be used to help you design your work. I often use comments as placeholders. So I know I need to do something there, but I want to get my whole structure in first. So maybe I'll just put a comment in saying, if something is true, then I'll just put a comment what it is I want to do when that happens. Generally speaking, comments for readability, I tend to put them in front of code blocks. Things like a loop or an if or a then, some function definitely needs to have them. Anything that maybe is a little bit more complicated, it shouldn't be a line-by-line explanation of every single line of code, but it should be a summary of maybe several lines of code. You want to really put them in as you work. All right, I'm going to scroll down a little bit here and look at data types and variables. So we've looked at some data types, and a data type is just what kind of value can be stored in a variable. And you have to set your variables before you can use them. And you set variables by using an equal. In this example over here where it says integer variable, I'm setting it equal to 1. That sets it. Now I have a new variable. It's called integer variable. The name is not what makes it an integer. It's the fact that I'm setting an integer to it. So 1 is an integer, and that makes this variable an integer. If I want to use a floating point number, a real number with a decimal in it of some kind, then I would use a float variable. Again, you don't have to call it float variable. You could call it anything you want, but putting this point something there tells the interpreter, okay, this variable holds floating point numbers. Strings are lists of characters, and so you can put numbers in here, but everything you put in has to be between quotes. And you have choices. You can use double quotes, or you can use single quotes. Just make sure you're not mixing it up. You can't have one side be a double quote and the other side be a single quote. And so I've got two different string variables. They both have the same thing in them, but you can put anything you want in there. And finally, we did touch on this a little bit in our classes, looking at what Boolean variables are. And a Boolean is something that's got two possible values. It can be true or it can be false. That's it. These are the keywords. You can see that they're pink. So these are special words for Python. Notice that true and false are both uppercase. So that is required if you're creating a Boolean. Make them one or the other. And again, the point that you must create these variables first. Line 43, 44, 45, I'm showing here, I'm creating a variable called x, and I'm setting it equal to 0. Because 0 is an integer, x will be an integer. The next line, a plus equal operator, says take whatever is in x and add 1 to it. I can't do x plus equals 1 unless I already have x set to something first. So this is the initialize step. You have to set it to something first before you can do the second one. If you want to try this on your own, just comment this out and see what happens when you run it. It should blow up and make some smoke. So you have to set it first. All right. If you're using the Python console, which I recommend when you're first learning how to code so that the graphics and all those really cool things that Codesters can do doesn't sort of get in the way. So I like using the console to begin with. There's two statements here I'm going to talk about. One is the input function. And we'll talk more about what functions are in a little bit, but it takes some kind of input into it. You put the question or the statement that you want to show up on the console, and I want it to say, what's your name? And whatever they type in, it's going to get stored in this user supplied value or whatever variable you put to the left of the statement. And it will store it as a string. If you were to print that out, whatever they typed in, that's what you would see. You can also format strings. So this plus operator join strings together. The thing between the quotes is a string, plus the user supplied value is a string because that's what input statements return. And then a plus says now join this other string together. So it will put them all together on the console when it's done. Okay, let's talk a little bit about casting. What casting means is that you have a variable of one type, but you're using it in a way that requires it to be a different type. Here is an example here. I've got an integer variable, int var, and I know it's an integer variable because I'm setting it equal to an integer, in this case, 5. If I wanted to print this out in a string or use it in any string, I have to convert it to a string because the integer 5 is not the same as the string 5, and that is a confusing idea. But I'm going to use the str function. Here's print, and here's my string. So I have my first string. The value of int var is, and then I'm using plus to say, hey, the next string gets added to it, puts them together, joins them together. If I just say int var without saying str in parentheses first, you will get an error because you're trying to join a number to a string and it doesn't know what to do. It needs both things to be strings when you do a join this way. The string will take this integer number and convert it to a string. I know it's confusing, but try to see what happens. If you were to take out the string part here and run this, you'll see the explosion that occurs. Here's an example of I'm inputting statement saying, hey, I need a number. And I'm putting a little note here because sometimes people try to trick and break these things, and I get it. But for now, just for this example purpose, let's say you type in a valid number, and that number will get stored in input number. Now, even though it's called input number, the input statement does not return a number just because you said to. It always returns a string. So if I want to use this number and say a mathematical calculation, and maybe I want to add 1 to it or whatever I want to do, I have to turn it into a number. And that int function here, it's another way to cast a string into an integer. It's going to take this string, let's say they typed in a string 5, and it'll turn it into integer 5, and then it's fine to add 4 to that, and you'll get some value. So again, I invite you to run this yourself, take out this int function, and see what happens here. And then I'm printing this out, but notice I have to cast it as a string now because x will be a number. It'll be whatever that number is plus 4. In this case, I'm converting it to a string to print it out. I actually don't really have to. If it's all on its own, you can just print out x and it knows how to do that. If I wanted to make this the number is and then plus, then I would have to make it a string. All right, let's look at conditionals. Conditionals are you want to run certain code depending on whether a certain state is true or not. So you're looking for a condition. And conditions are things that are true or they're false. That's the only thing they can be. And we have the if statement, the if-else statement, and an if-elif else statement structures that we can use. So the if statement just says, hey, if a thing is true, and you can use the keyword true if you always want something to be true, there may be a reason why you want to do that. You put the colon there because it's a block. Usually before anything that's indented, you're going to need that colon beforehand. This is 4 spaces over. I'm using this keyword pass. Pass does absolutely nothing. And the only reason it's here is because if I want this code to actually run through the Python interpreter, anything with a block, anything that has that colon and then something indented below it, you have to have a statement there or the interpreter blows up. So the pass statement is just there to say, hey, I just want to be able to run my code. I know that it's not doing anything yet, but I just want something in there to be a placeholder. And this will basically run every time because true is always true. But you're not really going to always be using true or false. You probably want to have some kind of expression. So here is an example of what an expression might look like. I'm inputting enter a number. And again, so that you wise guys always put the number in. Please put in a valid number just for these examples. We could talk about data validation a different time. The input returns a string. And so now I have a function around this other function that takes the input string that comes back and turns it into an integer and stores it in x. So x will be an integer variable. And here's my condition. If x, 2 equal signs, 1, and then the colon. If the value of the integer is 1, and you need the 2 x's, that says this is a compare rather than a set. I'm going to do one thing, in this case, just a print statement. And that's all it does. And if the x was not 1, if they input a 2 or a 5 or 100, it will not do that print statement. Now, very often, you want to do something if it isn't true as well, if it's false. So that uses else. Oh, I have it doing this again. If, input a number, maybe you want to put in a different number this time. So if x is 1, 2 equal signs, print, the code here is run, right? It's going to do this statement. Anything other than 1, that's what the else will make run. If they type in any number other than 1, if x is 1 is false. anything else, it will do what's under this else block. Now, you can have more than just these two choices. It happened or it didn't. Here is a third example, and I'm using the elif. And this is a really good way to test more than one thing. Maybe you're asking them to type in a menu choice, and there's 5 different options. Type 1 if you want this, type 2 if you want that, type 3 if you want something else. So you can check on that. So if X is 1, do this thing. If it's not 1, it goes down to this elif, because there was too much work to say else if. They shortened it to elif. If it turns out that they typed in a 2, and again the colon, indent, you're going to do this bunch of code. And then you can have more, you can have a whole bunch of elifs. Elif x equals 3, elif x equals 4, however many you want. And then it's always nice to have the default case here. Else, if it's none of these things, here is something I want to do. So that there's a possibility for everything they might type in. And then the last thing I want to discuss that we did talk about are functions. And functions provide you a way to define some code that maybe you want to run it more than once in different places in your code. Sometimes functions are used just to make things a little bit cleaner to read, but they execute elsewhere. So I've got my function definition here. So function definitions start with the word def. They always have to start with that, and def for define a function. And then you give it some name. I'm calling this one add numbers. And you can optionally pass in some arguments or values into a function. So I'm passing 2 things in. And then you put the colon, because once again, that colon says there's a block of code coming, which means you're going to indent 4 spaces. So this is a very simple function. It's not doing much. It's just going to add a plus b, and it's going to store it in this variable x, and then I'm going to return that variable. Putting a return statement in sends something back. It's optional. If you don't need to send values back, you don't have to put it in there. Python is not very specific about saying what these types are, so you sort of have to know. In my mind, these are going to be integers. So you must define it first. So now the interpreter knows about this function called add numbers. Later on in the code, you can actually use it. Now I want you to look at the indents here. So def is kind of column 1, and these are moved over 4 spaces. When I'm using it, I'm moved back over to column 1, and this has to do with what we call scope. So it basically says anything that's to the left in column 1, it can see other things in column 1, and so it knows now about add numbers. So I'm creating a variable called sum, and then I'm calling add numbers, and I'm passing in 2 constants, in this case 2 and 5. You could pass in variables that have integer values as well. And notice that these do not have to be called a and b. They can be any variables you want. Doesn't have to be called x, the thing that it gets returned in. In fact, the a, b, and the x, you can only use them. We call them local variables. You can only use them within that function. Again, it's a complicated thing. So for now, just keep your functions nice and simple. Sum equals add these 2 numbers, and then I'm just printing them out. And if all goes well, it's going to print out 7. I lied. That was not the last thing. The last thing is just to remind us how loops work. There are lots of different kinds of loops. We have mostly so far been using the counter in range loop, and it lets you repeat things. And you can repeat this thing 5 times. So whatever is indented, so again, you see the colon and then 4 spaces in, whatever is indented 4 spaces in will loop the number of times here. Now I put a hard code, a nice constant 5. You can make that a variable with an integer number in it. So I'm just making it very explicit here. So we'll run this loop 5 times. Counter keeps track of the number that I'm inside the loop. So the first time through, right, you go through 1 time, you go through 2 times, and I'm going to go through this 5 times. The tricky bit is that counter, that loop counter variable always starts with 0. So when I print this out, the first time through, your brain may be thinking, oh, this is time number 1, but the counter is going to actually print out 0. The next time it's going to print out a 1, a 2, a 3, and a 4. 0, 1, 2, 3, 4 is actually 5 times, and then it's going to stop. So there's a lot going on here. If I run here, I'm probably going to forget what all these statements are, but let's try it and see what happens. The first time through, it's asking your name, and so that one is over here. I'm using an input statement. I'm going to type in my name. And then we had the print statement. You typed the name into the console. Now we're going back here. It said infar is 5, so it's printing that out. just showing you what that looks like. Now I have another input, enter a number, any number, right? So I'm going to say, all right, 8. And then what it did was it took that number, turned it into an integer, and added 4 to it, and then printed that out so that I got 12. Now we're back in our conditionals. So let's enter a number. I'm going to enter 1. And so it is running this code. If I had entered any other number, you would not have seen that print statement. So I invite you to try this yourself. Then the second time through, this is a 1 with an L. So instead of doing a 1, I'm going to do like a 3 here. So I'm not entering 1. So the condition is false. X equals 1. That's false because my X value was 3. So it actually ran this second print. And then we're doing the one with the elif. So I'm going to put a 2 in here. So the code here that ran was this one. X was 2. Print the code here is run when 2 is entered because that's the one that was true. And now we're kind of seeing the rest of the output. So I did a sum of 2 and 5, and it did print it out. Sum is 7. It ran that little function. And then I was just printing out my counter over here, 0, 1, 2, 3, 4. I just wanted you to have this video as a place to review. I hope this is helpful, and thank you for watching.